Check 1 2. Check 1 2.
There we go. I like coming in here and seeing a full screen. This is great. Hello and good evening, everyone. I am Kevin Murdoch. I'm just going to wait a couple of minutes before we get going here, just out of respect. I know sometimes technology can pose a bit of a barrier to people, and I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to come in here before we actually call the meeting to order. But it's nice to see so many people attending tonight. And so I hope we have a chance to have a really thorough discussion. And so just give us about another minute and then we'll kick things off.
Audio.
Hello and good evening, everyone. I am Kevin Murdoch. I'm just going to wait a couple of minutes before we get going. I know we have to just, yep, thank you. We have to make sure that if you just all make sure you're muted and all the usual things. If members of council wish to put their faces up on the screen, you're more than welcome to do so.
Do we need this?
No.
I'm not sure why we have a screen being shared right now. Perhaps staff, can we just turn that off? Thanks. I'm not sure how many on here are on Zoom all the time, all day, every day, but I know many of us are. So I'm sure we should probably just do a little count of how many times people say, "Oh, you're muted" in the course of this discussion today. But we will be taking calls and questions from on here and as well as pieces. Hello, Mr. Herbert.
Coming back in a few minutes?
No.
Mr. Herbert, I can hear you.
Did you want me to
Is there a mechanism here?
Do it.
Is there a mechanism here? Thanks. So we can just make sure we track what's people on here. Can I get a thumbs up from counselors if you can hear me okay? I think I can, since I heard myself coming through a feed, so that's great. I'm just going to wait a minute here just to make sure. There we go. Thank you. I think we're 4 minutes in. I think it's reasonable to call the meeting to order here. And so thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is technically a committee of the whole. Council's only allowed to get together like this when we're in public. And when we are watching, and when we have a committee format. So this is a formal meeting of council, despite the informal way that we are actually managing this this meeting here. By way of, I'll go through just a few opening remarks, and then we'll get right to you. First of all, I just want to acknowledge that we are holding our meeting, and our community exists within the traditional territories of the Coast and Strait Salish people, specifically the Lekwungen-speaking people, known as the Songhees and the Esquimalt nations. We also recognize that their connections to these lands continue to this day. Tonight's really all about you, our residents, and we just want to give you a chance. I'm going to put my glasses on so I can see everybody's a lot clearer all of a sudden. A chance to talk to us about any issues of interest to you. We don't have an agenda beyond listening and answering questions, so we're looking forward to having that opportunity. Before we start the conversation, I just want a little bit of housekeeping here. The best way, if you wish to speak to us, is just at the bottom of the Zoom call. You can see a reactions button. You can hit that and hit the raise hand, and then I can call on you as we go through this piece. If you're on the phone, you can hit *9. If you called into the 1855 number, you can hit *9, and that will have the same effect. It'll pop up on my screen as a raised hand, and we can go to you. There is by all means, you're welcome to leave your camera off the whole time, even when you're speaking. You don't have to have your face on here, but you're also, of course, welcome to turn on your camera, particularly when you're speaking to us as well. The format tonight, we'll take your comments and questions. My job as mayor is largely to be the spokesperson for council, and I'd be addressing most of the comments and questions.
Just listen. I don't know how else.
And most of these comments and questions. So I'm going to miss some information, I'm sure, as I go through. So what I'm going to do is just make some space, probably twice during the course of the meeting, just to kind of circle back to members of council. If there's anything that I've missed, or then we'll come back to that. And if I misstate something, or if I miss something really critical, then please just raise up your hand as well as members of council, and I'll call on you as well to fill in some of those gaps. There is I also, just so you know, we have our Chief Administrative Officer, Lou Varela, is on the call with us, as well as other staff making notes. So our intention here is to capture the comments and discussions here, and we'll put out a response document, similar to what we did the last 3 times we've done this, where we've kind of what we heard, but also the intention is to include links to information and background. So on those topics that people raise. So if people had questions that maybe could use some more fulsome information, they would have access to that as well. So that's the intention tonight. I guess before, I also just want to acknowledge how hard the last couple of years have been. We've certainly had I think all of you and all of council has found this a difficult time. The lack of personal connections, the lack of sort of ongoing social contact, this time just spent at home has been hard. We've all turned into a bit of a hermit. We all seem just a little more thin-skinned, and things just seem more. And I think things like noises of neighbors seems to amplify much more than it has in the past, as we are at home that much more. So I think just want to especially acknowledge, in terms of the councillors, all of whom are here with us today. We thrive on those personal connections and hearing from the community. We have formal mechanisms within council that allows us to have that input on topics, but a lot of what guides us, what informs us, and helps us keep in touch with the community is those sort of informal meets and the community events and things that we touch, that we see you on an ongoing basis. So there's a real sense of disconnect on those pieces, and I just want to make sure that we're, joy's been kind of hard to find in these times. So I'm looking forward to this chance to have a talk. This is the first time in 2019 we initiated the first. We intended to have regular meetings like this. We were doing them in the community, so we did 3, and that was 2019. Then 2020 hit with a bang, and not surprisingly, we haven't had a chance to come back to that again. So we're really looking forward to this chance of speaking with you. Despite all of that, there's been a lot of hard work by council and by staff over the last year, and I'm really proud of the work and the approach to things the council has taken over this time. Both the sort of the commitment to debate issues, but not make things personal at any time. To work on the issues and really try and move our community forward, and really with that long-term vision of the impacts of what we're talking about. So with that, I think it's best just to go out to members of the public and take your questions. And as I said, I'll certainly cycle back to make sure members of council have a chance to speak to items that I've missed. If you feel that you want to say something, by all means. We can't really do seven responses to every question or comment. So I'll try and do my best to do the preliminary answer. And if there's the things I've missed or gaps, then I will certainly undertake to do that. So with that, who wishes to be the, if I could just turn off the screen sharing again. Thank you. We will, I can tell one of the people who are joining us is having a bit of technical issues in terms of getting access to the meeting. So all you have to do is raise your hand. And if I don't see a hand raised, I'm happy just to go to some of the questions we've received by email, because I think, some people did submit questions to us via email, and I'm happy to sort of start there if people wish. But just given people are here, if you have, I know it's always hard to be the first one. So please do raise your hand. I have a hand raised on Oak Bay meeting. Oh, that's just my hand. It's okay. I'm doing things wrong. Okay, not seeing any hands. I'll just raise, there's been a bunch of things that have come in, so I'm happy just to, I printed them off, the emails, and I'll try and just address them as best I can. One of them, I think one of the hot issues we've had over the last few months has been the dogs on beach issue. And I think we've had a lot of questions about what's happening on that. And so for those of you who don't know, there's a federal migratory bird sanctuary that covers all of our beaches below the high water mark. And the federal government has indicated they want to be more prescriptive in terms of preventing any dogs that aren't on leash from being on the beaches within that, which is all of Oak Bay. And so we are required to comply with that bylaw, or those laws. So we have implemented a dogs on leash piece of that. We recognize fully the impact that has both on our parks, which have now taken a significant increase in dog traffic, but also just the obligation we have to find some space. So there is some work that's going to be coming early in the new year to look at some possible temporary measures that we might be able to take to provide some off-leash areas for dogs. And longer term, as the federal government is committed to coming back with some updates in terms of what the regulations are more specifically to us, then we'll have a look at those and consider future policy pieces on that. I have a hand up. It says Jack Basie on the screen. I'll just go with that name. Welcome.
Thank you. Can I just state briefly, I won't take too much time up. My concern and ultimately question is founded on an environmental concern. And I think it arises from the present way building size is controlled. There's a mathematical formula that allows a new home, for example, to be built. And my concern is environmental because there's a phenomenon about not only large homes, but deep basements going into the aquifer. So my concern is the impacts on drainage, stormwater management. As I walk down Brighton with my dog, I see a new home being built and I see a continuous sump pump running over the last 3 weeks. And all that fresh water is going into the stormwater system of Oak Bay. So, and I have a neighbor who's built triple redundancy into a sump pump because they had a very deep basement over 10 feet. So my concern in this time of climate change, is there any way there should be a review? I think there should be a review of the impact of our zoning controls as well as the size of buildings as well as deep basement, to kind of minimize the impact on the environment. Climate change is here. We've had a phenomenon over the last summer of very, very dry periods. So I don't think we looked at that, and that's really my concern. Is there any means or any ability that council is going to look at the impact on the environment of the large home with the large deep basement? And I'm not even talking about the carbon that is expended to basically provide enough cement for these large basements. So there it is. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. I'm assuming it's Mr. Basie, but I don't know for sure. Thank you for that comment. So to answer a direct question, no. When the current zoning bylaw changes were made, the contemplation of the basements was based really entirely on impacts to the community in terms of massing, heights, etc. There are restrictions in terms of exemption, so how much you can exempt the basement that limits it from exceeding the floor area of the house, for instance. But that's the extent of that. So I think as we have a two items coming up here in near future. We have a housing framework work going on that's looking at multiple potential infill options for adding different housing forms in our communities or in our neighborhoods. And then we have a bylaw review that's scheduled to follow that. So that would be logically the appropriate time that we would look at those bylaws more fulsomely as we contemplate those kind of impacts. But I think it's fair to say, the realities of climate change and the impacts are impacting a lot of our pieces, everything from our storm drain design to aspects like basements. And in fact, there are now a number of areas in Oak Bay where you can't have basements, full stop. Or if you do have crawl spaces, all of the pumps, electrical, et cetera, has to be above ground because of the risk of inundation. So places like around McNeil Bay, the new houses going in there have those restrictions. So we're doing it essentially episodically and locally as needed, as governed by sea level rise and other aspects. But it will ultimately come into the design of those zonings. Councillor Green.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. And through you to Mr. Basie, thank you very much for raising this issue. And I will say that this council, as a group, is very concerned about sustainability going forward and climate change. We've talked a lot about it. And I think all of us, and we've seen the impacts, as you have, Mr. Basie, full force. And I think all of us are talking about sustainability a lot and about climate change. And I think a lot of that will be integrated into the planning going forward. I think that that's what we're all encouraging and laying some really good groundwork. But I certainly appreciate your comments. I've had similar comments from other residents as well. And the aquifer is an issue. I think for the first time in history this summer, the district of North Saanich was warned about its use of water and was asked to conserve. So drought and aquifer and water resources should all be on our radar for the future going forward. So thank you.
Yeah, there was a comment made just now by one of the attendees about this is happening in lots of places, people going down because we have limits to the house size, so people are using that space for living space or suites requests. That is absolutely the case. Luckily here, unlike in places in England where they have people going down 5 or 6 stories in places, we don't allow that to happen. We are restricted to the one story below ground. Are there any other? There's some things in the chat here, so I just want to. So, Mr. Amos, did you want to speak? It just says you have in the chat here that you can't raise your hand. So if you want to, I'm happy to take your question or comment next.
Sure. Can you hear me?
I can.
Excellent.
Welcome.
Thank you for hosting this town hall meeting. It's very timely. We, like the gentleman before, are very familiar with the Brighton Walkway and the idea of having a basement below ground level, which would be exempt from the amount of floor level in your house. It seems to very much to encourage people to do this. In the particular case on Brighton, to do so, they've had to blast through bedrock. It was 2 months of relentless blasting, rock crushing, and dump trucks taking away the rock and then bringing in fill to fill up the hole.
Not very environmentally friendly.
No, and of course during the rains, you could see what happens to a hole in bedrock, which is 12 feet deep. I know this is something that a bylaw could address and should address. I don't know that bylaws are able to address the rending of the neighborhood fabric, which takes place when people think that excavating into the bedrock is a reasonable way to go about getting a larger house.
Bring up what you wanted to say today, though.
Oh, what would that be?
Well, what you wrote about. Are we supposed to bring up about that variance for the house next door?
No, the variance is a land use item, so that's very specific, and we will take that at the council meeting, either in written form or in person. So yeah, land use pieces have a different format than this.
So
this
that's
just,
on Monday.
Yeah. It's very good to get to know the formats of these town hall meetings, and I look forward to participating frequently as we go ahead.
Thank you. And this is the first one we've tried through Zoom. So this is a little bit of an experiment for us as well. And by all means, you can probably just send it either to obcouncil@oakbay.ca or to myself directly at mayor@oakbay.ca to provide feedback on what worked and what didn't. And we'll take that advice as we sort of move forward to trying to hold these sessions going forward. So that's great. Thank you very much. I will say that the issue of blasting has come up a number of times, and it's probably worth noting that we do have a request. There is a report coming back to council, I believe in January, February, I think that is Q1 anyway of next year, to give us some ideas of what we can and cannot do. There's some federal and provincial mandates there that we have to allow a certain amount of access, but we'll have some more information on that to move that forward, because we've certainly heard from, as councillors, that issue of the blasting going on, or the even worse, really the whole ramming that happens that can carry on for much longer periods of time. I have go to the hand up here first. I believe it's Pruitt. You would just have to. There we go. You're unmuted. Welcome.
Hi, Kevin. I have a question about the sidewalks. Can we get an update on when the repairs will be happening for the spray painted orange bits? I've heard of a couple of seniors falling recently in the village on those areas, so it's just a bit of a concern.
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. So because it has been delayed, as you probably know, these were identified as major problems, and we had a threshold where we could no longer grind down the sidewalks effectively. And so when we went to take them out, we realized that those all essentially cross over the property lines of the buildings adjacent. So the property lines come out onto the sidewalk in those areas. So staff had to go and work out agreements for access and an intrusion on those spaces to allow us to do both above and underground work to repair those. So that is all being completed now. We're going to do the trees one at a time to kind of minimize the impacts. So it'll be sort of one thing to navigate as we're taking out one tree and replacing that tree. But we bumped up against the Christmas season, and in conversation with the Business Improvement Association, there was an ask that we didn't do anything else in terms of causing chaos on those sidewalks during the Christmas timeframe. So that work should be starting early in January is the intention.
Early January, like on the first tree, like one at a time. So
this plan is still, I think, to do one at a time, because there's quite a bit of. One of the issues we come up against again is that we don't really know what's under there. So they're a bit of a bespoke work project going forward. So each tree is going to have its own pipes and wires and conduit and stuff that we're going to run up against, that we're going to have to do a fair bit of mitigation. And then within that, trying to, having to put in the new, much better root containment system that'll go in their place.
I see. And that's what's caused obviously it's the roots of the big trees pushing up the sidewalk, making bumps.
Yeah, sorry, I should probably give some context, because not everybody knows. So when those trees were planted, in the batch, there was a number of Norway maples that were planted instead of another breed of maple. They were mislabeled, and when they planted, they over time that breed of maple lifts. First, their roots are very intrusive, so they're quite aggressive in trying to find places to go. And second, they actually grow out of the ground, and so they do a lot of lifting. And so what's become apparent is that's lifting all the sidewalks. So it's been able to be ground down over the last couple of decades or so, but we're at the end of that point where we can continue to keep those sidewalks level enough to be safe. So they have to come out. But yeah, we're doing them one at a time, because the roots will be going into various aspects of the underground infrastructure.
So are you thinking like by the end of 22, it'll all be completed, or?
Oh, I would hope that they would all be done by the end of 2022. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
We have a question here. Sorry, I have a very sensitive mouse.
I don't think it's really.
Oh, did you watch? You can unmute yourself and speak. It's better if you raise hands, just so we can have a. So there's a question here. More focus on infrastructure and storm sewers, just as they're old. saying, I hope we can be done with managing tax increases. We have to defer or stop doing other things. Thank you. So, for those who aren't aware, one of the key priorities of the council was to, and this is not easy to do politically, to just sort of directly address the real infrastructure deficit that we have as a municipality. We have underfunded the replacement cost of our infrastructure. That's all aspects, sewer, storm drain, water systems, roads, sidewalks, for decades. This is a pretty common problem in municipalities, but we did acknowledge that. In fact, it was acknowledged even by the last council, which started at 80. Started the last the asset management review process. What we've done, and I'm sure you've seen it on your tax bill, is start applying a lot of significant tax increases directly attached to those pieces. There is no way of doing that without doing some tax increases. We are just structurally underfunding our assets. And so we have pretty good understanding of what those numbers are. In 2021 numbers at the beginning, 4 years ago, we were about, say, approximately $9 million a year under, and we're down to about $4 million now. We hope to kind of get some additional savings going forward by better planning. So there's a couple of aspects there. One, as we get in front of the break fix, right now we spend an inordinate amount of time doing break fix work. So rather than replacing a whole pipe that's 100 years old, we're replacing 10 or 15 feet when it breaks. And that, of course, has no added value. So we want to be in front of that. So we're getting into the replacement process before they break, which brings a significant cost savings. And also by having secure financing and long-term asset planning, that also allows us to apply for grants, and we are hopeful that we can also seek grant funding to help mitigate some of those costs as well in the long term. I guess finally, by committing the money now, we're going to have to front end a lot of work. So, there's 100 years of work. We really have to do the bulk of that the next 25 years. So we're going to have to borrow money as well against that. And again, the earlier we can do that, the dollar value of that goes down because obviously there's an inflationary aspect to deferring the work as well. So those are all the mechanisms that we're using to kind of keep the overarching costs down. And those are the ways we save tens of millions of dollars. It's hard unless we actually fund it properly and securely, it's really hard to start taking advantage of those other ways of getting those costs down. So that was from Ms. Lalonde. So I hope that answered the question that was put into the chat. I have a hand up from Susanna.
Hi, thank you. I'm just wondering if you can provide an update on the secondary suite report and what kind of action council has been taking in response to that.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, we've had actually a few emails on that topic prior to this meeting as well. Obviously, it's top of mind because we're in the middle of it. Actually started by the last council. Just before the council ended, they signed a contract to undertake the secondary suite. So we've been moving that forward. At the same time, we're also moving forward a housing framework, and the housing framework is really designed to look at multiple housing forms within the really single-family home residential neighborhoods. But suites is another housing form that also fits there, and so we've been moving that forward. I guess it's been now, with multiple inputs and coming back and forth to council really since probably the end of the first year as a consultant was hired and started that work. We've had the work of the consultant is completed. We've had a look at all the various potential models. We've given a fair bit of direction in terms of what aspects of that we want in terms of owner occupancy and other aspects. Are we going to do a more proactive or light touch? Are we going to require registration, or is that going to be voluntary? So we've given those high level guidelines. So that's moving it forward now to the how to implement stage of it. So that's in the next 2 months. I'm guessing that we'll have those come back to council. Again, all of that is available for public input. So if you have thoughts, we always welcome those, because that's how we capture the ideas and concerns and possible positive and negative outcomes of different approaches. So that's really the next phase, and that would ultimately lead to the application of suites. The direction that council has given is to allow for suites across the municipality, and then with those the constraints and the guidelines guiding the use of that. And the actual management of that is really down to is still to come, because we don't know if we're going to register the use or the development of those suites or other aspects. So I think it's probably 90% of the way through, but there's still a lot of details in terms of how we get that coming forward. And I think one of the realities that I think anybody can acknowledge with suites is that in the best case scenario, it's hard to get people to register. And one of the primary reasons for going through all this work is to get them registered, because a key value here would be to make sure that our fire and police are aware if there's people living in a basement and separate, that we make sure that they're aware of them and that they're living in safe environments. So that's our job going forward, to try and make sure that we're getting to that. And we have some ways to go, but we're a long way down the path at this point.
Thank you. Are you able to provide more information? You mentioned there's another housing forum options that have been developed. What are those? Sure.
So this is all part of the official community plan. So
okay.
that have identified some potential housing. So what we call it a housing framework, mostly because a housing plan tends to get replied to affordable housing as opposed to broader form. So this is looking at what are generally referred to as infill housing options to allow for different housing forms within our built environment for our single family residences. So those would typically be laneway houses, duplexes, triplexes, heritage conversions, townhomes. That's probably the gambit, really, that are identified within the OCP. And our goal here is we probably won't get to regulation, but we should have a very good direction to give to drive what's allowed and where by the end of this term. So we're scrambling a little bit. We have a depleted building and planning department, and we're going through a restructuring of that department simultaneously. So it's not easy to move this stuff forward without the staff in hand to help, but we are absolutely doing everything we can to move that forward as well in this term.
Thank you.
No, you're welcome. Thank you for the question. I'm going to move on here. I'm just sort of looking. Oh, so the question on Oak Bay Lodge and where that's sitting at and its proposed uses. So for those of you who don't know, when the Oak Bay Lodge closed, the land transferred to from the Island Health to Cap Regional Hospital District, which is the regional body that handles capital grants for Island Health. As the owner of that land, they're going through a demolition process for the existing building and are looking to redevelop it for some healthcare specific use. Island Health has to come up with both capital and operational funding to supply those healthcare services. And they are, I guess I'll say this as broadly as I can because I can't commit them to anything. The district obviously would like this resolved as soon as possible and like to see some good use of that for healthcare services. Cap Regional Hospital District, very similarly, they have a piece of property that has much more value in use than not in use. And Island Health has a lot of demands on their operational and capital dollars. And so they're going through that analysis right now, and that they will come back, I anticipate probably in February, to the hospital district board with their what they can and can't do. But that's a hopeful guess because their processes are fairly in depth, as you can imagine. It's a multi-billion-dollar budget that they have to kind of contemplate, and there's demand all over Vancouver Island for capital and operational dollars. So what I've heard so far, the feedback from the public has been, the first round was fairly clear about seniors housing or seniors services. There was some asks there about some, addictive services or other sort of drug rehab services. It sounds like that's probably, there's enough senior type services. I think the goal here, from all partners at this point, and again, this is unofficial until they work out what capital and operational dollars they can have, is the goal of having a center of excellence for seniors care. But that's an aspirational goal right now. And until that hard work is done by Island Health to kind of come back to the table, and that will then guide the building form that comes out of the hospital district and and then the next steps of that. Oak Bay's role in this is a little bit convoluted. We hold a covenant on the property that we have to let go for it to be used for something other than seniors care, and that would happen. That ask would happen as part of a rezoning. We are the land use holder, so the hospital district has to come to the District of Oak Bay for approvals for any kind of rezoning. And that's really where we have a look and have our say on the application. They're very generous in hearing us, and we are reflecting the concerns and ideas that we had from the community as best we can. However, at the end of the day, we can't be seen to be dictating their application, because we have to receive their application at the end of the day and make a decision about whether or not it meets the community needs or not as part of that application. So that's essentially the status currently of that. So I would anticipate early in the new year, if all goes according to plan, that we'll have some sense of that list of services that might be possible on that, and a timeline hopefully will be attached to that as well. And I should just throw a little shout out here to our MLA, Murray Rankin, as well, because, well, he is again is hands off. He's been very key. He's been sharing information with us about what he's hearing, and he's obviously an asset to us to make sure that we have the opportunity to be heard if necessary, and to build connections where necessary. So there's a lot of really strong goodwill here to make something great happen on that site, but there's a lot of work to get from the will to the reality. And that was Rick that asked that question. The ask of Curtis, is there a maximum basement depth in bylaw? Yes, there is, but it is essentially a full height basement. I'm sorry, I'm trying to scroll through here from the sideline, so please forgive me as I go through this. But if people are online and wish to ask, it's nice to hear your voices. Honestly, I've deeply missed. I've seen written texts, but I haven't had a chance to see people's faces as much over the last little while. So if you don't mind putting up your hand and speaking to us, it's nice to hear voices. Go ahead, Curtis. You just have to unmute. There we go.
Sorry about that. I guess my question I put in the chat, can you talk about the municipal owned houses that the refugees have been living in? I heard that the organization is running out of funds to support these folks.
Yes. Yeah. So their lease per terms of the agreement, they've asked to leave early, so that will be 6 months or 5.5 months from now. And so we are going to be looking at use for those two buildings. At a high level, there's already some discussions going on with some other potential service providers that might be able to use them. This is a little bit complicated in two ways. One, the municipality, for us to allow those uses for below market values, have to go through a dispensation of property process. So we do have to go through a public process and have justification for doing that, which would be acceptable. I think we had it previously. A little bit more complicating is the fact that those two buildings were acquired and are considered to be in play for whatever we decide to do in our village planning process. So in our timeline, granted, it would start with the next council for the meaty work. The foundation work is already underway or should be soon on a village area plan. And so that village area plan will really determine like what sorts of everything from building size and massing and setbacks and sidewalk sizes, what kind of businesses we want to have there, how much parking we need to provide, all those sort of questions will all play into that. And so we are holding those pieces of property just to make sure that we have them available should we need them for anything in that village area plan. Because that's 2023, we don't want to have any commitments on that property that bind us beyond that. It doesn't mean that they can't be used beyond that. In fact, that was a conversation when Verks had it was, we had that agreement that was understood that it could end at that point. But we had a model by which either party could give notice and exit past that point. So that's essentially the status of them. I'm heartened by some interest already in that, and certainly if there's any service providers that see some value, I would encourage them to reach out to myself or to staff to raise that, because we are going to be looking for some use for those properties. We don't want them to sit idle.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Curtis.
Oh, I was just going to say there's more questions in the chat.
There is. But I have Eva Eaton has a hand up here, so I'll take that one, and then I'll go to the Rick Lee written question.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. This is a great idea to have this town hall. I just want to ask again about, I see an intersection between suites, taxes, and infrastructure. So I live in a single family home with just a single my husband and I, but yet around us, it's very obvious to me that there are many suites in houses. Some homes even have 2 suites attached. And I feel like the municipality or the district of Oak Bay has somehow lost control over how many suites there are. And I don't think that these people that have all these suites are paying the same, I believe that they're paying the same taxes as I am, but yet their demand on infrastructure is significantly higher than the 2 people living in the house as we are. And I also see another issue of parking on the street. There's some streets in my neighborhood that are almost impassable now. I can't imagine a fire truck trying to get down them because there's so many cars parked on each side of the street. So I'm just wondering, how is this going to be managed? And, like I feel like I have an unfair tax burden given the fact that I am not using the infrastructure to the same degree as these houses with 1 or even more suites. Thank you.
Thank you and I think it's a totally valid question. And I think one of the things that we're, and we certainly welcome public input onto this. We have given direction at this point to include a mandatory registration process for the suites. We have not yet figured out what that fee structure is. It is a delicate balance in how we do that, because whatever we'd like to say about enforcement, the reality is that most jurisdictions that have gone through this path have a very hard time of getting people to come forward and register. And I think for issues of public safety and code compliance, we would like people to do that. And so we'll be looking at a number of different options of how we manage that. That may be based more on use than it is on the actual, just the fact that you have a building capable of having people in the basement. Certainly the bylaws don't contemplate, the changes we're contemplating don't contemplate 2 suites in a building. There are, however, situations in which we've had a heritage conversion recently that it was a duplex and made a triplex in that process of the heritage right revitalization agreement process. And so those sort of things, are contemplated as being possible within the community. They're rare right now, but those are some of the other things in the housing framework. I think it's important to when we look at weight on infrastructure, there's 2 aspects. I think parking is the most immediate, and we haven't quite resolved how we're managing parking as it relates to suites. That we'll be coming back to council for some further direction. But there's a number of ways of contemplating that. But that's probably the most obvious. The impact on things like sewer and storm drain is much more minimal. Storm drain, really no impact. Sewer, very minimal. And one of the reasons for that is when looking at the capacity for this housing for suites, our single family homes we generally had much larger families in the past. So if you look at Oak Bay's population in the 1960s, it was larger than it is today. We've actually shrunk, which is almost unheard of. It is unheard of in Greater Victoria. And so, the housing forms that we have are the same, and the use of those houses has changed quite dramatically in terms of their occupancy. And so, the best of our understanding, we can certainly manage those impacts without any peace. And the other part of this, of course, going back to that asset management question earlier, we have a incredibly large asset management work to come. And so as we're doing that, we're redesigning that with the contemplation of making sure that they're being right-sized both for climate change and for any potential increases or needs attached to that. But it's not typically that large an impact on those two pieces. The tax question is really a question of fairness. And again, we haven't worked out the fee structure. And so I think council hasn't contemplated a change of taxes with that because the zoning will be allowing for suites. So the fee structure would come with the registration of those suites and in that process. And through that, certainly we would hope to collect all direct costs. So things like garbage pickup and other aspects. And of course, water bills and so forth are to capture utilization based on use for the whole household in any case. So I hope that helps answer, but you're still here. So did I answer your question sufficiently?
Yeah, I just had just as a follow-up, I just see this as a very low key initiative. I don't see a kind of, I see maybe at the carrot, but not the stick. What if people do not register? What is the municipality proposing to do to get an accurate representation of the secondary suite issue in Oak Bay and also recoup some of the additional costs of the issues?
You're right, and we haven't determined that yet. So there is almost certainly going to be a carrot and stick approach to this. What that looks like, though, is yet to be determined. And again, I would just really encourage people as this is coming back to council and we're having those contemplations. We really do. we miss having people in the chambers where we could see you and listen to you, but we take the written communications or the call-in communications very seriously. We find that they provide an enormous amount of value to us in our contemplation of what that should look like. This is a really tricky one because most jurisdictions have a very hard time getting suites to register. And so we want to make sure that we're creating a framework that encourages people to do that. It has to be seen to be reasonable. It can't be punitive in terms of cost. We also want to make room in there for people to be able to justify investing to make these any suites that exist safe, both to code and just to make for general livability. And so that's the fine line that we have to walk on this one. And certainly, creating a non-registration penalty that's sufficiently large that it's worth registering it, and a registration fee that's large enough to cover costs, but not so large as to dissuade people from coming forward, is really where I look to my fellow councillors here around the table and to have that contemplative discussion when it comes forward. And that's how we get the wisdom. And I think it's really important that we have that, 7 very diverse voices all thinking about these problems with the eye to a resolution. But we only have so much knowledge and experience and thoughts, and it's often ideas that are left field from the public that help kind of spur us with innovative ideas. So if you have some, please share them with us. Thank you, Ms. Eaton. That was great. I had Kathleen and then Rita Perrick and then Bruce Kilpatrick on my screen. So I'm just going to write down those names so I don't forget them, and then I'll come back to some of the written questions. Welcome, Kathleen. You're still muted.
One count. Thank you very much. Thank you for doing this online system. It's much easier to sit in my dining room. I'm really interested in all the conversations around infrastructure and housing, but I just want to, I might not be able to stay for the whole meeting, so I want to change the topic just a little bit. And it has to do with reconciliation and in decolonization. And I'm interested to know what actual actions council might be planning. And specifically, I want to reference an email I sent to you and to actually our MLA and to Chris. I didn't copy all of council this time, although I have in the past, and I keep harping on this topic, but it pertains to parks in Oak Bay. And I'm aware that quite recently the Saanich people had a meeting with Saanich people to talk about park planning and to engage them, I think, in some active way of working with that kind of land, which of course we know is their traditional lands. I don't in any way want to criticize the Friends of Uplands Park because I'm a co-founder and I have volunteered for them until 2020. But I am very concerned about not the removal of the invasive plants. I think that's very much a settler activity and a contribution to reconciliation and decolonization. But I'm much more concerned about the actual restoration work. And in many of, like in Saanich and in other parts of Victoria, restoration work is done kind of collaboratively under the advisement or at least with consultation with the Indigenous people whose traditional territory that is. And I think it's fair to say that something like Uplands Park, I mean, we wouldn't have those amazing meadows if they hadn't been built, maintained, and managed by the Chiconian family and by the Lekwungen peoples. And it's not that I want to put an extra burden on them in any way, shape, or form, but I'm trying to think of ways that we can at least facilitate the opportunity for that kind of collaborative blending of Western science around restoration, but also that incredible traditional ecological knowledge and Indigenous science. And I'm thinking that we do get grants from the federal government to do the restoration work. It's very much focused on endangered plants. And I would like to encourage, as one very positive thing I think Oak Bay could do, is that whenever you do any grant funding or requesting, you always put in an amount of money that would allow you to compensate participation by First Nations people in the work of, if they're interested in restoration and interested in helping, that we have a way of compensating them, and that we shouldn't be really proceeding at all without at least inviting their participation, not to come and pull the ivy. I think that's a settler job, but to actually plan how they should be restored and what the use is. I think the framework of all the restoration should be done in the context of these are culturally endangered ecosystems. These are places of food, of medicine, of all kinds of cultural practices. And I feel concerned that we are proceeding in a very, as far as I'm aware, we are still proceeding in a very Western science colonial way in the way we are approaching the dealing with our parks, and specifically Uplands Park. I think the other thing that I'd like to encourage is that we do a really good job of bringing our school children into Uplands Park, for example, and the other parks, and to participate in planting and doing all kinds of things. And I know it's an educational thing, and I know it's an important work, but I think about, if we had compensation, if we had funding, perhaps there would be an opportunity to invite Indigenous students to come over and learn about this particular park. And I'm just wondering if there's ways that we can collaborate, take the best of Western science and restoration, but make sure we blend it or braid it. The term is braiding with Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous science. So I don't understand. I have been asking this and talking about this for years. I think another a very important action we can do, and I feel very responsible for this, but I am a co-founder of Friends of Uplands Park, and I was very instrumental in having those kiosks put up in Uplands Park. And I feel very despair, actually, that we did it without an engagement with the Chiconian family or with the Lekwungen people. So, I mean, I think we need to address that. I think we need to look at the traditional place names. And I think maybe that kiosk needs to be replaced and invite an Indigenous artist. And much as I love that kiosk, and we did our best with good heart, I think, to represent it, we did it in the absence of collaboration with Indigenous people. Again, that would require funding, and I just wish I could know how to proceed on this, because I think it's really important that Oak Bay take some very active steps, assuming that, and I may be wrong, it may be that there is no interest for the Lekwungen people or the Chiconian family, but I think we could at least create opportunities, and has to be funded. There has to be a way to compensate participation, and if we're asking for their knowledge or them sharing knowledge or participation in how to restore these parks, that there has to be a compensation. So I'm thinking that we don't accept any habitat stewardship fund from the government or from anybody unless we can build in that kind of compensation for Indigenous participation. So I'd be really interested to know why you haven't responded to my email, except I harp on the same thing all the time. But I guess I'm very interested to know what your plans are to try to address reconciliation and decolonization, and specifically restoration of our parks, if possible, if there's interest in collaboration with Indigenous knowledges.
Sure. There's a lot there to unpack, so I'll try my best, Kathleen. You make some excellent points there, and I think this is council has certainly made commitments to building those relationships into developing processes that are incorporate guidance and knowledge of our First Nations neighbors as part of that. In fact, we're actually looking at funding a position for the next 2 years as a way to build up our own internal knowledge and to help guide those sorts of reach outs as we're undertaking any project within the municipality. I don't have much details on that because we haven't finalized that, but that is certainly part of our way, because I think we struggle, like many do, with not knowing what we don't know, and sometimes we make those asks and it's at the wrong time, or it's in a piece. And in fact, I was just chatting with one of the Songhees elders, who's a knowledge keeper, about just this, about their desire to ultimately find a way to come back and do at least ceremonial harvesting of camas back in that park again at some point in the future, and there'd be no opposition to that at all. I think the question is, how do we kind of get to the point where we can have those conversations and more importantly, I think build that into the into our processes. And I don't think there's any pushback on engaging that. The other part of that is just, you talked about the kiosks, which is really part of a broader plaques piece. And I guess you should be heartened to know that we have another kiosk going into another park, and that is going through a much more fulsome First Nations review process. So it takes a lot longer as we go through that piece, as we're collecting that data knowledge. But it's going through that, and we're not signing off on it until we have that First Nations review and sign off on it. So that policy change has already happened on pieces. So it's an incremental piece, and we're also Councillor Appleton, along with the Heritage Foundation, also just has initiated a piece here where we're doing an inventory of all of our plaques and monuments in the municipality, with an eye to, again, with First Nations guidance, look at the wording of those and the placement of those, and are they reflecting effectively First Nations stories and histories as well. So we're not there yet, Kathleen. No, we're definitely not. But there's nothing you're saying is going against the grain of what the intention of the council is on this. It's just we're working through this about how to build some of that knowledge into our internal processes, and ultimately through the volunteer groups and so forth as well.
Okay, well, that's encouraging, and I thank you. And I just see that Bruce Kilpatrick, there is a reconciliation Oak Bay. Is that associated with the municipality as well? Is there a collaboration there between those two groups?
No, it's a recently formed group, but they are coming and presenting to us, I think, on Monday to give a little update about their formation and what they're hoping to achieve. And I've certainly spoken to Bruce, mostly to the pastor at Oak Bay United Church, who's one of the leaders of that, and to discuss issues about what they're trying to accomplish. And there's absolute alignment there on that, I think, in terms of trying to make sure that we're finding ways to building those relationships wherever we can. And again, it's hard to talk about things that are in the pipe that are specifics at the moment.
And this position you talked about, is this an Indigenous position?
Correct.
You would be hiring somebody who is Indigenous?
That's the intention.
Well, that's fantastic. I really appreciate that.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry, my husband just didn't realize I was in
I couldn't hear anything. It's all good.
So he distracted me a little bit, so I'm sorry about that. But all right. Well, I'll try to connect with Bruce, and like I said, I don't want to take anything away to the fantastic work that's being done, but I really despair that it's being done in this colonial settler Western science framework. And I think we really have to address that as a community. So thanks very much. And I appreciate the opportunity to have a chance to talk. Okay, back to sewers and houses and I'm interested in all of that too. And also I'll have one more question. When are you folks going to pick up the leaves? They're all over the place and they're just blowing and there's never been quite such a long time since the leaves have been picked up.
I can't address that question. We've tried to come up with a better scheduling model for people to get their leaves out, but it's proving problematic every year. So I can't answer the question in this format, Kathleen. I'm sorry.
Okay, well, they're going to be blowing back up onto the trees pretty soon, I think. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Very much. Okay,
So sorry, we took a little bit of time there, but it's an important topic. Rita, why don't you go next? And I'll go to a question or two from the thing, and I'll come to Bruce. Go ahead. And hope you don't mind me calling you Rita in this format.
No, not at all. Thank you for the forum, setting up the forum, and thank you to all the councillors and the mayor for your service. I think it takes a lot of courage these days to put yourself forward, so I appreciate that. I want to come back to suites and the climate crisis, and I just want to hear a little bit more about the conversations that you've been having and how the climate crisis has been informing the policy discussions, in particular around parking with new development and suites. And so my understanding is that every dwelling has to have 2 parking spots, one of which has to be covered. And if you have a legal suite, which, and part of this is based on our own experience, we have one of the few legal suites in Oak Bay, which requires us therefore to have parking for 4 cars, 2 of which have to be covered. And it's no secret to the city, we've never been compliant, but we are being asked to become compliant. And though this is not a personal discussion I want to have right now, it's about the bigger principle of essentially asking residents to build houses for cars instead of being able to build houses for people. And in the process, I've been reflecting on the climate impact of paving lawns, taking down trees, and using all those materials to build a 2-car garage, and then create paved parking for an additional 2 spots. The behavior that we drive when we ask that kind of compliance, the behavior towards incentivizing car buyers to buy cars, or if you're not going to put a car in your garage or 2 cars in your garage, to then accumulate stuff that you will eventually put in your garage. And in the midst of this crisis, I just wonder if we should be thinking about incentivizing a different kind of behavior by reducing the number of spots required for primary and secondary residences.
Sure. Thanks for the question. I don't want to get into because we haven't actually decided on this yet. This is one of the issues that all the points you've raised have been raised at the council table and as part of the discussion on this. There's a lot to unpack in that. Everything from if people move to electric cars, can they park on the street at all, and do we have to consider those aspects as well if we're going to zero internal combustion cars? And we haven't resolved that yet, so that's still coming back to council for further discussion. All I can do really here is assure you that everything you've said has been brought up and discussed at the council table. And those are the kind of contemplations that we have to consider as we're undertaking those regulations. Are we going to require additional parking? I think we can all agree that it does force some additional paving and therefore reduction of green space and runoff. At the same time, we have often very narrow streets, and there's a lot there. And so ultimately, this is where council earns its money, is these ones that have a lot of nuance in terms of how we move it forward. And maybe we can use it in a way that creates some incentive for registration and so forth as we do that. So there might be exceptions under certain circumstances, but those are the details I think that we really have to get to kind of make sure this works for the community.
Okay, and just to follow up, I'm really happy that climate is informing your discussions. That's excellent. I'm wondering about the expertise behind that, which is not to say I don't trust your own expertise and those of councillors, but is that being formed by people on staff who have climate expertise specifically? Has there been some sort of climate impact survey been completed around and how it relates to policy around infrastructure and suites? Is that happening or?
That's a good question. I don't know if I might even turn to see if any of our counselors want to answer that one. I think that it's our, we've required that the climate change, the impact on the environment, be included as part of the staff, considerations and their expert opinions on pieces. Does every person on staff have a certain level of climate certification or something? I don't think I could answer that question. I don't know the answer to it, but there is an organizational understanding of that lens being applied to all those pieces. I will be honest, we are a small town, and so our departments are often 2 or 3 people, not 40 or 50, and so we just recently supported as a council the ask of whether or not we'd support the creation of an expanded climate service at the CRD. Which is intended to provide some of those broader expertise and data collection pieces to inform and share with municipalities. And we supported that, I think, quite easily because we don't have that expertise in-house. And so to be able to use that regionally, that lens and use that body of expertise is very helpful to us. So it's not, it's sort of a yes and a sort of a no on that answer because we don't have any climate scientists or things of that nature, but we do definitely contemplate as things like sea level rise and impact of climate change on our design of assets and building code and so forth.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate your.
Yeah, my pleasure. Oh, go ahead, Councillor Appleton. And a person with a great deal of interest in this area and a fair bit of knowledge as well.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, I just wanted to point out and just remind everybody that and respectful of your comments about capacity for sure. I was really pleased to be the chair of the Community Climate Action Working Group that formed in the district and did its work between sort of very late 2019 and into 2020, right before the COVID pandemic hit. And the Community Climate Action Work Group came up with a list of 5 top recommendations that were brought before council, and 4 out of those 5 were accepted by council and have resources and tasking associated with them. So active transportation funding, the cool kit that the mayor referenced, funding for climate action projects in the community, and looking at things like energy retrofits for buildings. So it was a really successful initiative, I feel, and really got some good information from the community on sort of priorities for climate action. Not comprehensive or exhaustive, but definitely is, and I believe, from what I've seen of council's endorsement of the recommendations, it's informing where we go on climate action. Thank you, Worship.
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. Very, very good points. And actually, when you say it like that, I realize we put a lot of pressure on you as chair of that group to come up with, analysis and recommendations in incredibly short order at that time because we wanted to get it in time for the budget and strategic planning process. But in hindsight, it got us under the bell of the COVID hit, which would have completely interrupted that. So it was very nice to actually have those completed prior to the COVID curse. I think it would have delayed everything quite considerably, as all of the staff were suddenly dispatched to deal with a lot more issues. Bruce, I'm going to come back to you in just a minute here. I just want to get to a few of the questions that people have been typing into the agenda. In fact, one of them might even be from you. So from Jack Basie, rates are consistent with those adjacent municipalities. We're not probably going to be the same as adjacent municipalities on the secondary suites regs from the direction that council's given on this. They will be different, and that will create some confusion and frustration, I'm sure, on some people's parts. But I think the expectation here as representatives of Oak Bay that we do take that wholesome look at our community and what drives it. It says from Bruce, take it from you say the majority of council will be voting to legalize suites throughout Oak Bay, and the question that is now being addressed is to what extent they will be regulated. yes, I guess that's probably not an unfair statement. Obviously, at the end of the day, I can't predict how council is going to vote. I think in fairness, we have to look at the sum of all of the parts. We've given direction on 8 of 10 aspects of the suites, and we're coming back with two of those. And I guess at the end of the day, if we can find a way to get the majority, for the majority of council, ideally the plurality of council, that's always our goal, is to find consensus that addresses the concerns that have been raised and addressing both on the it's too confusing and will turn people off, and it's too much and it'll create too much chaos side of the fence. I think we're trying to use our wisdom of Solomon here to find a path that will bring us to a regulated state. But the intention here is not. We see this. I will say. I think we've been pretty clear as a majority of council. This is one housing form. It is not going to save the world, and it's not going to dramatically change things. We're trying to get to the point where we can. Right now, suites exist and they're regulated through a little bit of an extremely ad hoc sort of complaint-based system that doesn't do anything at all to address the health and safety issues. And so and it doesn't allow for any revenue for the municipality. And so we are taking that piece as pretty seriously, that we see that this is a legitimate housing form, one of many that we're going to be contemplating. And it's it's one that I think we can address the concerns with and the opportunities with as that. So we're trying to find that path that finds the balance. Before I go back.
Okay, town hall today.
Oh,
it's me.
So and Rickley's question was the fee structure for suites cover police, fire, library, town hall costs, etc. So it's an interesting question. I think that's our job, is to find a way that kind of makes sure that, and again, this is part of the discussion we've had about, do we actually dedicate proactive enforcement of this, or are we doing it more of on a registration and then complaint and enforcement basis? And we opted for the latter because we only have really 1.25 bylaw enforcement personnel, and so we have to be realistic about what that person can do. So the costs go up with more complicated, and these are all the discussions that have led us to the point that we're at right now. So will it cover 100% of all the costs? I don't know. I think a lot of that comes down to how much uptake we get in terms of registration. Bruce Kilpatrick, thank you. I wanted to just get to some of these written questions, so there's quite a few of them stacking up. So I see you actually also wrote into the piece there, but go ahead, Bruce, and welcome to the meeting.
Thank you. Much appreciated. Good evening, council members. And I wanted to clarify that I am not Bruce who's writing in about secondary suites.
No, different Bruce.
I guess I'm just one of many Bruces in Oak Bay. And my concern and question tonight is on a different issue, one that has not really come up so far, and won't be a surprise to members of council with whom I've had conversations over the last several months. It is with respect to community engagement on the new Oak Bay Marina lease and the redevelopment of the adjacent Spewhung lands. And if you bear with me, it requires a little bit of a preamble, and I'll try to be as brief as I can with that. As council is aware through those conversations, there are concerns in the community about how limited the opportunities for public engagement have been around this project. And I think it's fairly widely held to be the case that the marina and the Spewhung lands and waters are just an extraordinary public asset, and perhaps the most significant opportunity to advance reconciliation with the Songhees and Esquimalt nations through economic partnership that exists in our community. So in 2019, which was more than a year before the RFP was issued that was looking for a proponent to take on a new lease for the marina and the adjacent lands and waters, the district put a document together that was entitled Lease Negotiations Support. And I've seen this document. It's 27 pages long and very thorough. I compliment the author of that. It talked about, I'm going to provide some quotes here, the marina and associated open spaces are critically important to the Oak Bay community. It also suggested that the lease must be supported by the community at large and support the vision of the official community plan. And it asked a consultant to consult with First Nations, to design a consultation process for the Oak Bay community, to create a consultation plan, to conduct public engagement activities, and to engage the public. And so my question, and I'm going to make a couple of comments after the question and then ask for some comment would be great, is what changed the thinking on this? I think had the district followed that path, that a number of the very significant concerns out there would have been addressed. And because it's chosen a different path, I think there's some pretty significant concerns held by a number of people that we're really missing out on a huge opportunity here to put something really exciting together that will engage the community and that will allow us to really advance reconciliation in a significant way in our community. I know council's talked about the possibility of funding consultation on the public amenities associated with this project, but that is much more limited and very narrowly focused as compared to what could have been. And I know last month that Councillor Ney at one of council meetings indicated that she felt that the consultation with First Nations should have taken place before the Marina RFP was issued. And I know that back before the last election, one councillor, I think his name was Murdoch, had said that it would take years of consultation to get it right for this site. And so I guess I'm concerned and disappointed that we find ourselves in this position today. And it would be really great to get an explanation about sort of what happened. How did we veer off the path to be really a very positive way to take advantage of this really extraordinary opportunity. So appreciate the clarification. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. And so I'll do my best. So this is I'm a little bit limited in speaking to this. As you know, we are in the middle of actively engaged in negotiations on the land with the lead proponent for it. That has not been resolved yet. So there's nothing I can really speak to in terms of what will ultimately come out of that. So talking to process, there are a number of different ways that you can go about these sorts of things. Ultimately, the direction of council on this one, and certainly you're right, back I think in 2012, I raised under the priority setting for council the option, the idea that we should start early preparation for the marina, understanding that the tighter you get to a timeline, the less options you have in terms of process. And I think that's just a harsh reality of land use planning pieces. We have a very tight timeline on this. It is tied to a provincial water lease process. And working backwards, we knew there would be a lot of negotiations required if we were going to be, even with a lead proponent, to get to a final resolution. We didn't anticipate anything would come back that met all of our needs. And so, within those timelines, I'm not sure, I'm not clear on the document that you're referring to, but we can talk about that offline. But certainly coming to council was a number of various options in terms of pieces. We looked at using some external consultants to try and rapidly consolidate some information for us. We were unsuccessful in getting anybody qualified to do that work. And so we've undertook to do that internally and undertook the things like the site analysis, building analysis through a third-party contractor to give us both the status of the land and the buildings and stuff, so that when we were going out to RFP, there would be an even playing field for all the players. We ultimately decided to go through an RFP process, and any procurement process, and it is a procurement process, is very bound by the procurement process required for public pieces, and that it does not, I will say, align very easily with First Nations consultation and reconciliation. All I can really say to that is, there are because this is a commercial lease and a bid process is a little different than a broader land use piece. So the core part of this was leasing the upland buildings and an operator to run the marina operations. And so That's the core part of this. I appreciate the opinion that the consultation on the amenities is not sufficient, but really what accounts for amenities is almost the entirety of the upland portion of that property, and so it's actually quite a large segment of the of space for public use. I don't know how much more I can speak to it beyond those sort of generalities.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you. Be quite happy to provide that document to council so that everybody's aware of what I was referring to. I'm not sure if council members have seen it previously, and I'm happy to put it in a place where other folks who are part of the meeting tonight can also access it. And Mr. Murdoch, the only thing I would say sort of in conclusion on this is that I think this document also had it right in terms of looking at this as a process which was very much about land use. And to think of this as a procurement process right from the beginning, I think really limited the possibilities for this extraordinary site. And this very, very different from buying photocopiers or from securing services. It's probably, in my opinion, one of the most most important decisions that council is going to have to make, because it's going to have implications for 30 plus years, and many of us won't be around to see the next time that this comes up for public discussion. And again, it's a public asset that we really need to make sure we make best use of and can be proud of. So thank you.
I don't think anybody disagrees with that, Bruce. And certainly it is a very different process from a photocopier. And I think, there was we had, just for the benefit of the public to know, you know this, there's a lot of assistance in this guidelines. So we had a fairness advisor to ensure that through this whole process we're following best practices for fairness and transparency. We really stretched the limits of what's allowed within a bidding process to ensure that we provided for public input. So we created a bit of a convoluted multi-part response requirement that broke out the financial, the technical, and the amenity portion, so that we could allow for some public input on those amenity portions as well. And so you're right, it's definitely not photocopiers. And I think it's absolutely reasonable to I think the path followed the timelines required for that piece. I can certainly appreciate the opinion that some people may wish to have done more of that, but there was, again, 600 or so responses to that public input process that helped inform the analysis portion of the public amenity piece. And again, nothing is settled. It also helps inform the negotiations as well at a very, very granular level, including all of the individual comments that came in that have really helped raise specific knowledge bits as they came forward. So I'm going back to the piece here on the Jack Basie climate actions, reviewing bylaw to encourage recycling of existing building materials from demolitions. In fact, yes, I don't recall where that's sitting at. That's in our list of things. Councillor Green, do you remember where that's sitting in terms of timelines? I think it's a little bit in hold as the City of Victoria is going through the same process of looking at options that they have.
Well, as you know, it's been a real bugbear of mine, and it began at the Heritage Commission years ago. Councillor Braithwaite also has shared my concern about demolition waste management, which is what I'm calling it. I think we have sent it back to staff to take a look at it. I know it's been a priority for a long time, and I think it rests right now with, is it not, with the planning and building department? But Kevin, I'm sorry, it's been a while.
Yeah, I know it's been a while since we looked at it, so I don't remember that task either. So maybe we'll get the answer to that question and include it in our summary document for that as well.
I can also say that this, along with blasting, again, have been concerns of this council, and certainly, these are both issues that we will continue to focus on until the end of this term. And I think people hopefully will understand that it for me anyway, and I think others have shared this. This pandemic blew a real hole in this term. And so many of the things and so many of the ideals and hopes and dreams and goals that we had, each of us coming into this work, a lot of those things have been put on hold for good reason, because of the lack of public engagement. We couldn't gather, the hall was closed. So there have been a lot of barriers, but these issues, that does not mean that they have gone away. And in fact, I think there's more of a sense of urgency among many of us to try and get some of these addressed before the end of the term next year. So thanks, Kevin, for asking.
Yeah, thank you. It's funny. I was trying to write down some notes for myself just to kind of go over so I could reference them of pieces of response. And I just going through the list of things undertaken in the last 3 years. I kind of liken it to there's been a lot. It's kind of like we're renovating the community. We're really doing the foundation work. So, it's so much of the work that's been undertaken. And my notes went to 3 pages before I just kind of gave up on the pieces here. Has been really sort of, I don't think seen by the public, except in the quality of the work or the timeliness of response or the access to information that comes out of the council. And I just, I was funny. Yesterday, the grumpy taxpayers gave us their bronze medal for our asset management plan. I saw, but I was noting as well that they gave Langford first place for live streaming and archiving their council meetings, which we've been doing for a few years, and they gave the second place Review Royal for implementing a code of conduct, which we've had for I think 5 or 6 years now. So I don't feel too bad if you think we actually did in many ways a clean sweep of that piece. There's so much work to do. It's quite remarkable. And I'll highlight, I could talk about 100, but I think that sort of foundational piece is so important. And I think this council has really taken an effort to look at what changes can we make, even if they're not glamorous, that will have a substantial impact on the community in the long run. So something as simple as actually implementing proper document management systems internally, funding that, supporting it, and seeing that has dramatically shifted as new documents are created. Particularly, they're all indexed correctly, are searchable, are findable by across all departments under the same documentation system. And so as people are looking up information, it's dropping the search time for each individual employee, often from hours down to minutes. And so the cumulative effect of efficiency is really, really critical, but it's sometimes hard to make that initial investment to get to that point where you're getting those efficiencies, because there's a cost up front and a savings over a very long time period. And so I'm very appreciative of the fact that we've taken that approach, because I think it's natural in even in business, but certainly in government to not do that. I just have a couple of other emails that came in here. One from Jean, I'll refer to because she made a couple of points. As we talked to blasting, but there was a question around carbon reduction in building and building code changes and bylaws that we might implement. And so the short answer to that is we have to follow a little bit of what the province allows us to do. So what council has supported is inclusion of the step code in new builds, so that we're following as the province rolls out their increasingly more stringent requirements for new builds, for climate pieces and for environmental. Our bylaws follow those step codes that are attached to that. So that's typically the way we would do it. That's not something that we would, again, without investing an enormous amount of money to do sort of weird bespoke bylaws. It's just easier to follow those kind of practical approaches to those pieces. And there's also questions around excessive lot coverage and size of houses that I saw from a couple of emails. And so I'll talk to those. We're just in terms of the planned order of business here, we are completing suites, looking at infill options, and that will lead to intentionally to get to a bylaw, a broader bylaw review that can incorporate those changes plus new in 2024. So some of those aspects will be in there. for reconsideration. I do want to point out to people that are looking at the size of houses going in. I think there's because there's also a question of can we not, prevent big houses going in beside a row of smaller houses, and that's something we could certainly contemplate. But generally speaking, within a single zone, you have consistent allowances, and so there are certainly parts of Oak Bay that have small bungalows, and so the larger house going in beside it really stands out. So a lot of the current bylaw works around encouraging more traditional forms that have a smaller, for the same footprint, have a smaller feel from a streetscape perspective. And again, I guess we also are considering ourselves we have a pretty high value on trees and green space in Oak Bay, and so we currently have lot coverage. Like the largest lot coverage, if you have a single family home, is 35%. For normal houses, it's 25% plus 7% for an outbuilding, and so that's 32%. The smallest restriction in say Victoria is 50% or 40%. Most of it allows for 50 or 60% lot coverage, and similar in Saanich. So the houses that are going in are larger in many cases in the existing buildings, but they're also context-wise actually quite a bit smaller than is allowed in our neighboring jurisdiction. So I think that's always just helpful to know. As we're doing that review, we'd have to consider, those contexts, because that was certainly looked at in the creation of the current bylaw. And I will also just point out, and I think the criticisms are absolutely valid and always welcome, because there is no, I think any approach you take to it will have a certain number of negatives attached to it as well. So the previous bylaw relied so much on variances that there was 15 variances a meeting coming to council, to the point where there was almost impossible to do a thorough adjudication of it. The current bylaw scales houses to the lot size. So on very large lots and very small lots, those buildings can look at a proportion, because they, if you get a narrow enough lot, things can look large when they're allowed to have the same height. So those are those pieces. Curtis, you had Councillor Appleton. I'll let you go first, and I'll go back to Curtis. He has his hand up.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just wanted to point out, I know things are coming fast and furious in the chat, and you're trying to keep up with it. It's a little bit easier for us. So I just noticed that there was a question that was pushing its way up from Alejandra. I hope I get your name right. Asking, is there a way that we can prioritize Oak Bay residents who pay Oak Bay taxes for Oak Bay recreation activities, in terms of getting up early and having a hard time getting, I think a lot of parents have had that experience of getting up super early to register your children for swimming classes. So
no, none of us have ever done that.
Lost. Thanks, Worship.
Do you want to answer that?
I leave that to your sage counsel, Your Worship.
So it's an interesting question. Yeah. So the question here, trying to sign up kids to a swimming lesson at 6:30 a.m. was stressful, and many were sold out within seconds. And so, can we prioritize Oak Bay residents who pay taxes? Yeah, that's an interesting question. We haven't done that. I don't think it's even really been contemplated. So I have to just, that's certainly nothing I can reflect any kind of council policy on. That's just the way it is. I'll make this observation though, because I think it gets forgotten sometimes in our discussions around the different municipalities. And we hear a lot of griping from Victoria, for example, about how many taxes they have to pay to cover the cost of policing in the core, et cetera. What Oak Bay carries for the region, frankly, is the cost of recreation services. So Oak Bay has 3 rec centers. We have Henderson, our main rec center, which is a multi-use rec center, as well as Monterey, in addition to a number of parks, buildings, and so forth that are available for rent and use. That's a fairly high burden for a small municipality to carry, and we have a very high recovery rate. They are subsidized, but we have a very high recovery rate because we couldn't possibly afford to have this. You go to City of Victoria, they essentially have the Crystal Pool as a single facility servicing all of their residents. And so we carry those costs. And frankly, we are so dependent upon the goodwill of people coming from all over the region to use our facilities. We have to keep it at a very high and desirable level. That it's very hard for us to do anything that might risk those relationships. So I think there'd be a bit of a caveat there. I think part of the problem we have right now is we're struggling, like a lot of jurisdictions are, particularly in recreation, of getting qualified people to work. And so some of our actual programs are actually a little bit more restricted than they normally are. And so that's actually created some issues. And then we also, that's our youngest attendant. There we go. Hello. And so that's part of the piece of that. And so that's a bit of a temporary issue. And of course, COVID has put some restrictions as well in terms of our the number of people we can carry in certain classes and so forth. I'm not sure where that status is currently, but certainly over the last 2 years, that's really had a big impact on our ability to allow people in. So it doesn't really answer the specific question, but that's my musings from a philosophical point of view without having any kind of council direction or mandate on it.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. It highlights how bizarrely wide our issues are that we deal with. Everything from swimming lessons to sewage pipes to First Nations relations to recreation services and police and fire, and it's quite fabulous actually. If you like a lot of variation in your life, this is a good thing to do. If you're watching and interested in running for council, this is what it's like. You get to deal with a lot of different things. Thanks for that, Councillor Appleton, for flagging that, because I had seen it on the way through, and then I didn't get back to that. So I don't see. I've been kind of rambling on here, and we're getting closer to the end. And I did offer the opportunity for all of council to speak and capture anything I've missed or wanted to add anything. You're more than welcome to do so. So I'm happy just to go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Unmuted here. Thank you, Mayor. I've just been taking some notes of we did also receive a lot of correspondence, and you've covered a lot of ground, but just a couple of things of note that have come out quite a bit. One with the infrastructure, how the district deals with transportation safety, and that's certainly been an issue again during pandemic, because we've rejigged some of the roads to make them a little more pedestrian friendly. So you might want to speak to that. Management or supervision of construction sites, which some people feel is becoming a bit cumbersome or unpleasant. And then the relevance of the OCP, and especially in the context of climate mitigation. Climate change is coming up, and our OCP, it touches on that, but perhaps not as a climate emergency as we have declared it. And also truth and reconciliation is not really addressed in the OCP, so maybe relevance of it. So that's the last three that I noted that you might want to speak about. Thank you.
So what was the cumbersome one? You sort of cut out my ear for that.
Yeah, that's management and supervision of construction projects. I think there's a feeling, and perhaps with us being more neighborhood bound during pandemic, we're probably much more aware of what is happening around us than we ever have been before. And and there has been quite a bit of construction going on in the district for our small community. So just how we go about managing, or perhaps if we have to reconsider how we give oversight and supervision. And you did touch on that, I think, when you talked about staffing in the building and planning department. And that might be something that we want to just chat about for a few minutes.
Sure. Thanks, Councillor Patterson. So the comment is absolutely correct. Our OCP certainly acknowledges the climate and environmental pieces, but it doesn't go as far as this council has in terms of recognition of it as an emergency and driving more proactive response to that. I think really we OCP revisions are cumbersome and lengthy. It is overdue, I would say, but we've been so focused on getting these housing pieces through in this term that I think we really that just hasn't been a priority to go change the OCP, but it's certainly reflected in the directions given by this council, and I think it's worth noting that. So not changing the OCP to change the language does not mean that it's not reflected in the operational urgency that we have. I think the oversight of building as a whole, that's a fairly operational piece. I think what's worth sharing with people here is just a little bit of the, I'll be careful talking about this. I don't want to put anybody from staff on the spot or anything, but I've had the interesting position when an emergency declaration is made, emergency operations kick in. And so for a significant portion of time of this term, the Emergency Operations Center, which is manned by staff and not by council, takes over to respond to all of the rapidly. We had over 500 changes in procedures and internal processes to deal with this. We had to come up with health and safety plans and other things. And what I got to witness in that course of it was, again, being a small municipality, that Emergency Operations Center wasn't made up of a few sort of ground level people or people who had expertise in this area. It was staffed with all of our directors. So the director of engineering, the director of planning, the director of financial services, the fire chief, the police chief, were all in that room together and dealing with these constant, like daily changing demands on every aspect of our operations, from garbage pickup to parks and recreation issues to access to the hall and everything else in between, and just people seating arrangements in every work environment. And so what I witnessed in that was staff can either buckle under that or they can respond in a way that is really positive. And what I've seen and what we have a real blessing of in Oak Bay now is a leadership team that has worked under fire together and are really closely aligned. And I think we really have to be very appreciative of that response, because what we have now is no barriers between departments. There's a lot of easy communication, and they get together weekly, if not more often, to talk about issues and make sure that there aren't sort of silos happening. And that's to the great benefit of our community. And also over this time, we've hired, this council, a director of strategic initiatives, director of finance, deputy director of finance. There's been quite a few director of corporate services, and our new chief administrative officer, deputy corporate officer. So, this council has in fact gone through a hiring and an allocation process where we sought not people willing or interested in maintaining a status quo, but in interested in developing centers of excellence in their pieces. And so you're starting to see that we're winning awards for our financial reporting and for our financial processes and the way that we're kind of getting information out and sharing it and being transparent. And I mean, it's funny that the province announced that they were going to start charging $10 for FY. There's a universal agreement. That's absolutely not what we're trying to do here. Like there will be no fees attached to that in that way, because it goes completely against the grain of the intention of the staff. And so, we're all of the finance, corporate services, all of these. This is not council doing the run of the pieces, but it's under the leadership of our CAO and under the leadership team. And so what you're seeing, and I'm circling back to the point made in the building piece of it, we have an opportunity here. We are two senior people in building and planning retired. And so we're taking this opportunity to do what was done in the finance department and corporate services to take this change in leadership to make sure that department is also a center of excellence for us going forward. And so those things like the oversight of building permits, the timeliness of response, the simplicity of applications, the clarity of process of things coming forward have all seen improvements. But I think we're really looking forward to the chance of making that department reflect much more of that sort of very, very high level, what I see daily, and I'm very excited about, because the level of excellence and expertise and energy to make. It's interesting. A number of our leadership team have moved into Oak Bay, if that gives you an indication of their confidence in the direction that we're heading here. So I think there's a real ownership of this community within our leadership team, and a real excitement about doing things as examples. And I want to reflect that. So I can't speak so much to the building and planning, but I'm thrilled about this chance that we have right now to see that reimagined and rebuilt with some new leadership in there and a new vision and as part of that team. And I totally respect the people who are working there before, but all these changes always give an opportunity to re-envision how we can do it better. So I'm hoping and expecting that you'll see some really great things as part of that team as well going forward. So I go to Councillor Braithwaite.
Thank you, Mayor. I know we have a very limited amount of time, so I'll keep it really, really short. Just a couple of things I'm hoping you can touch on that came also from some questions from letters that we received. One is on blasting, and I know you touched on it briefly, but perhaps you can talk about the blasting bylaw, where that stands, and protection of housing stock. Just maybe a few comments on that. And then also, this has been a great forum. I think it's been very well received by the public, and it's been very well attended. And I'm hoping that perhaps we can have a discussion on when we can have our next one so that people can come and do this again, because I think it's something that's really needed in the community, and it's obviously well attended, and people are kind of chomping at the bit to be able to have some input. And I think it's so important.
Yeah, I'm just looking at my screen here. I see at least 60 people, it looks like, on here, which is, I think, is about as many as we had combined for the 3 that we did in person back in 2019. So I think we're all keen to have these discussions. So very quickly, the blasting bylaws coming back Q1 of 2022. The issue of demolitions and housing stock pieces is a really important one for the community. And I think that's way too big a topic to get into in great detail here, other than, part of the reason for the housing framework is to find ways to use our housing stock better. And if there's changes made to that the changes that happen are meeting the needs of the community. And that's incredibly important work. I think that I'm going to give one really quick example of this, because it's something I see in losing some of this older stock. I've seen multiple cases now where we have a perfectly well-built 1950s sort of vintage house that is lived in and, right through to the end of life. And in the last 5 or 10 years, the maintenance of that house starts going downhill. And by the time the people who are living there might want to move into a little lower maintenance townhouse or something, but they don't want to go downtown Victoria. There's no place for them to move laterally and free up that house for a family to move into it. And so I think, at the end of the day, by the time they do leave, the house is often at a point where to renovate it or restore it is so expensive that it just gets taken down and rebuilt. And I think if we're going through this process, if we start finding some of these housing pieces and allow for some of that lateral movement so people can live in the right kind of house within their neighborhoods, within the community, live their lives within a shared area around family. That's the way that we're going to start protecting a lot of these homes as well, is we don't let them get to the point where they don't meet the people's needs. They're not being maintained in the right way. So there's so many things that play into this. I think it's too big a topic for this, but I think as we go through the housing framework piece, this is again where we get the great wisdom of the community to give input to help give us some of the guidance on that. And those are the 2 things I noted from what you said, Councillor Braithwaite. Councillor Zelka.
Oh, thank you, Mayor. Just hearing some of these wonderful comments from all the members of all of the Oak Bay residents that are here on the call. What's very important to me overall, some of these comments coming through about community engagement and transformation and transparency. The comment about the Oak Bay Rec Center. Unfortunately, we lost the commission, the Oak Bay Rec and Culture and Parks Commission before the pandemic, but it's one you could possibly touch upon as one of the 2 items I wanted to bring forward on the committees and commissions process going forward, and how we're going to ideally bring forward a new committee for Parks, Rec, and Culture that will allow some of these great suggestions coming forward from the public to influence policies with our swimming facilities, amongst others. That was one. And I was wondering if you could also touch upon the fact that we are at this very moment, as a district, climate neutral, with the incredible work that's been done on energy management, tracing back to some task force work that was done back in 2008, and then the CARET program that has continued year after year with some great work done by staff that the public may not be aware of.
You're aware of it now, Councillor Zelka. Thank you for raising it here. If there wasn't lots of questions, you'd probably hear me spend 2 hours going on and on about all the things that have been done, but I think they would bore everybody to death as well, because I think what we really want to hear is what we haven't met the expectations and how we can meet those. So you're right, those are all the climate neutrality of those pieces, the intention of continuing that great work of driving down our energy use is all fantastic. In terms of the Park, Rec, and Culture, yes, you're right, Council made the decision that structure, and in fairness, that structure was put in the 1970s when there wasn't a senior staff contingent. It was essentially brought in to run the Parks Rec facilities. And so by the time 2019, 2020 hit, it was that structure of that body did not meet the needs of that body. It doesn't mean that we couldn't see some benefit in some sort of body of committee or commission that could be involved in that. First of all, if you do run across things like bandwidth issues with swimming or those sorts of things, at the end of the day, the politicians, it's nice to know about them, but you can reach out directly to Parks, Rec, and Culture. I think I pointed out that we are required to provide excellence of service and to survive, because that's part of, we just carry so much burden of cost otherwise. And so I think you will find staff incredibly responsive to those pieces. We can't always adapt, but don't wait for policy change or for the institution of a new oversight, because our job in Parks, Rec, and Culture is to be service oriented. And so I think you should have that expectation, and you will see that if you go to them. And I can't really speak to what's coming next, because ultimately that's going to be council's decision in terms of what kind of format we put into that. But for the public's awareness, that's coming back early in the new year for council consideration about whether and how we might want to look at a volunteer body to be involved in either the oversight of that or engaged on a project by project basis, or I think in broad terms, it's worth noting how much value we get out of our volunteers, both on committees and commissions and in volunteer organizations in the community. And it's one of the great frustrations I've had over this term, I will say, is that we did an enormous amount of work of rejigging all of our committees and commissions and the pieces. We put in training, we put in supports, we put in, we provided staff to, so that we could actually keep minutes and provide supports in the meetings. We did all that work, and then COVID hit, and so all these have just sat almost unused in a really disheartening way for the volunteers involved. And despite the best efforts of staff and council, we're just starting to get back into the piece of this as we go forward. So I just think we could not operate as a municipality, frankly, if we didn't have volunteers both on committees, commissions, but also just out doing Friends of Uplands Park was mentioned earlier. People, groups like that drive so much good work in our community. So take this opportunity just to say thank you to all of them. Before I go to you, Councillor Green, I just want to, because Curtis has his hand up again, the intentions of letting the public speak, then I'll go to Councillor Green and Councillor Ney. Go ahead, Curtis.
Thanks, Kevin. There was a question about off-leash dog parks, and I think I remember reading something about that recently in council priorities.
Yes.
So maybe you could speak to that. And then after that, there was another good question from Patricia Lane about affordable housing and what they're doing in Burnaby.
Okay, I'll try and find that question. So I'll take the first one and then I'll go to Councillor Green. Off-leash, I talked about at the very beginning of this. So we've had this sort of hammer drop from the federal government on the migratory bird sanctuary, and so that's really restricted the off-leash dog use of beaches. We also have a lot of pressure on our natural parks, obviously trying to protect the rare and endangered species that exist there. So the priority coming forward is to look at potentials for temporary off-leash dog areas as we undertake a much larger sort of dog plan in future. We recognize there's some short-term urgency, and so that's something that we're going to look at, whether there's anything we can do in the short term to help give people who own dogs and want their dogs to socialize and play off leash, that we can provide some space for that. Because right now they're almost forced to go over to places like Cadbro Bay, and I'm sure they would appreciate us finding some additional help to mitigate the impact there as well. Go ahead, Councillor Green, and I'll try and look up on the. Was just for my clarification, Curtis? Was that comment from Patricia Lane on the? Maybe I think Patricia Lane's here. Maybe I'll just.
It's at the bottom of the chat.
Okay, I'll go there. Thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Green.
Yes, thanks, Kevin. And I was just going to mention that Ms. Lane had a comment around the use of building materials and specifically cement that is produced through a low carbon process.
Okay.
This is again related to climate change. First of all, I just wanted to thank everyone that's participated tonight. You know that I'm a great supporter of community engagement, and we started with the neighborhood meetings, as you mentioned at the beginning of the session tonight. I'm hoping those will resume once pandemic eases. I've heard a lot of wonderful suggestions tonight, but also I think they focus primarily on climate change. There was a question from someone on Estevan about stormwater management. And of course, in view of the recent rain events, I think that's a big issue for people in Oak Bay. Also want to shout out to Public Works, who worked 24/7 during that heavy rain to help people with flooding and flooding basements. Also want to say very quickly that speaking of volunteers, and thank you for the comments, we are advertising for volunteers for committees and commissions at the moment. So for any of you that are interested in serving, and it's a great way to participate, another form of community engagement, please apply, or please get in touch with either staff or any of us as council members. All of us have a responsibility to committees and commissions. And I guess lastly, there was a question to ask us to list our 5 priorities going into the last year of the term. We don't have time to do that, but I think many of them have been identified tonight. And mine, of course, remains improving community engagement, and I can't wait until we can get back to in-person meetings. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Councillor Green. I think what I read in Patricia Lane's is really asking for us to contemplate those 2 pieces. So yes, we can definitely do that. And part of the mechanism here is we can capture these comments and give some feedback and reflect back on them, but they'll certainly go into our pieces. I want to just point out as well, my notes in terms, and I probably missed something. We do move things forward by initiatives for strategic priorities. So currently scheduled for trying to do completion is infill housing strategy, the housing framework in terms of developing options for Oak Bay, the marina lease completion, asset management and infrastructure renewal continuation, moving that more into how are we actually going to scale up our internal systems and people to manage that. So just to put that in perspective, we're doing $2 or $3 million a year in capital, and we're going to move that to more like $12 to $20 million a year. So there's a really large increase, and so that takes some planning internally. And investment, land use procedures bylaw, cool kit, and the blasting bylaw are things that I have in my sort of short to medium term for this council to try and get done this term. Councillor Ney, welcome.
That's an awful lot there. We're getting near the end. I do appreciate this. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I really don't have anything else to add. The other councillors have picked up the bits and pieces, but I do want to say I've really found this extremely constructive, listening to people's perceptions, their concerns and their ideas and innovations that they've offered here tonight. And I noticed that staff is going to take a lot of the information, the questions, and provide the answers on our website, which is really nice. And it really shows how the way people participated here now can be shared with the rest of the community. So there's been a lot of good information that's been shared here. So thank you to staff, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you to our public for taking the time to be here today.
Thanks, Councillor Ney. I think we're 7:59 on a scheduled 8 o'clock completion time. It's hard to get much better than that. I'm just got one more message just popped up here. I just want to make sure I don't. Yeah, I think this format someone pointed out is actually in some ways better than in person in that we have access to a much broader group of people. It was really nice to see a young child, which we've never seen, pop up on screen, and this format allows for people who are busy with other parts of their lives to come and attend and take part in it. I just have to say, can I just say thank you to everybody who has attended, because this has been the first chance we've had a chance to, in any way like this, to sit down en masse and in an open way just to have a conversation. And you never know how they're going to go. I really just appreciate the just a very respectful and thoughtful approach that everybody attending here has taken in written and verbal forms. And it's been my experience in Oak Bay that we're all trying to make this place that we love a little bit better. And so that tone came through here today. Absolutely. I know we can't always make everybody happy. We do try, and this format, to my mind, really helps us understand sort of what our key priorities. And so it's important. It's important for us to have these connections as council, and it's important, I think, for the community to have access to us and be seen to have access to us. So this whole format came out of actually that some work done by councillors looking at ways that we can improve public engagement, and this is one of many, almost all of which have been implemented by the council. I think there's 52 or something recommendations, and most of those have made their way into some form. Everything from moving meeting times or agenda times forward to this more sort of more visible aspect. So I'm glad everybody is here, able to join us today. I really appreciate. It's nice to see some. I know most people are blank, but I've seen a few faces, and it's lovely to see those faces. And looking forward to seeing you in person more often as time comes forward. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Good night.